Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. For those of you guys who don't know me, my name is Divyanka and I'm a doctor of pharmacy here in the US. On this channel, I'm striving to provide both you and I resources to help live our best and most productive life. Now today's video is actually a continuation of the functional area Pharma series that I have going on my channel. I did an overview video of all the different functional areas a PharmD can go into within the pharmaceutical industry, and then thereafter we've been going through each functional area and taking a deeper dive look into each one of them to really understand each department. So today we are talking about regulatory affairs. Now, in my humble opinion, I actually think regulatory affairs is probably one of the most valuable places a PharmD can gain experience in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, I'll go into why in a little bit, but first let's backtrack and look at fellowship stats. So, based on the IPHO 2020-2021 PharmD Industry Fellowship Analysis, this past year, there were 87 fellowships available in regulatory affairs, making it the second most popular functional area for fellowships, both in terms of interest and availability. And of course, like every other functional area, there have been more and more fellowships added to regulatory affairs every single year. All right, so what is regulatory affairs? Regulatory affairs really oversees how drugs and medical devices are developed, tested, manufactured, marketed, and distributed, and they are involved in each of these steps to really certify that the products themselves and each of the steps meets regulatory standards for human use. Overall, the regulatory department is responsible for a lot. First, they have to ensure manufacturers' compliance with any applicable global legislative and regulatory requirements. And they have to do that at each step of the development process, so all the way from research and development to the preclinical phase, through the clinical phase of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, and then, of course, into marketing and post-marketing. Along the drug development process, there are many times where regulatory submissions are required to move on to the next phase of the drug development process. So again, regulatory is really responsible for all of the work that needs to go into that. Next, they're also responsible for keeping track of all the different updated legislative, not only in the countries that that company might be in, but globally. Basically, anywhere where that company is looking to distribute its products. Regulatory is also called upon for advising on different legal and scientific restraints and requirements throughout the drug development process. Anytime there's a question as to what documentation is needed, what the process should look like, etc., usually regulatory strategists are involved in those conversations. Of course, just like every other functional area, regulatory affairs is also responsible for collecting, understanding, collating, and identifying scientific and clinical data. Again, that data goes into all the different regulatory submissions, so it's very important for every regulatory person to understand what that data truly means. Along with that, regulatory is also responsible for giving any strategic and technical advice to the different functional areas from a regulatory standpoint. And these functional areas can stem from medical affairs and clinical development, but also into commercial, marketing, market access, HEOR, etc. Another huge responsibility of regulatory affairs is to make sure that all of the records and documentation is kept correctly. A lot of submissions require annual reports to the FDA or to any other governmental agency depending on the country. And to fill out those reports, it's of course important to understand what happened throughout the years, and that requires immaculate documentation. So regulatory is really responsible for that. Now, the different subdepartments and how regulatory is actually structured really can depend and change per company, but there are some general subdepartments that exist from company to company. The first subdepartment is advertising and promotion. As you can assume, you're dealing with all of the marketing assets and making sure they're compliant with all regulations for all purposes. You need both a scientific, business, and legal eye for this, so again, the skill set within advertising and promotion is definitely really niche and interesting. Next, we have drug labeling. As you can imagine, a whole team and a lot of work what goes into the actual drug label of a drug product, and that label needs to be updated and regulated and is different based on what country you're filing a submission for. So it's incredibly important to have a huge team for this. And of course, your label needs to be compliant with all regulations, but also needs to be very scientifically sound. So the team working in drug labeling, again, needs to have a very deep technical background. Next, we have chemistry, manufacturing, and control, also known as CMC, and this is really understanding all of the different processes within the manufacturing, chemistry, all of that testing. That knowledge is really important because, again, all of that information goes into the different submissions to the regulatory agencies, and it's incredibly important to understand how to decipher that information, how to get that information, and then how to relay that information to the governmental agency. Next, we have strategy. Of course, just like every other functional area, will have the strategy and operations teams. But with regulatory strategy, of course, you're giving insight and advice on where different submissions should happen, what needs to go into making those submissions possible, strategy behind any meetings with the FDA that you would want to make an appointment for, etc. Of course, strategy is a huge part of the drug development process from a regulatory standpoint, and so having expertise within regulatory strategy is, of course, very, very valuable. And lastly, you have writing. Medical writing is basically the overall umbrella, but you can have a writer in every different functional area, and they would generally be under the scope of medical writing, but have an expertise of whatever that functional area is. So in this case, it would be expertise in writing different regulatory submissions and documents as a writer. So why would you want to go into reg affairs? Overall, regulatory as a department is definitely seen as a gatekeeper between the company and the regulatory agency. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory as to why it's important to have that close relationship with the regulatory agency and really understand what goes into that, what key components are important, and what to look out for. That experience, again, is invaluable. And while sitting in regulatory, because you're seen as that gatekeeper, that definitely comes with a little bit of power and leverage within the pharmaceutical industry in terms of comparing functional areas. Basically, in general, the rule is if you can understand your client, your customer, whatever it is, you'll win, right? So in this case, for regulatory affairs and for a pharma company in general, their main client is the FDA, because if they can get through the FDA, if everything goes through fine and they get their approvals, their products go to market. So if you're sitting in the department that is the liaison between that company and the regulatory agency, then again, you're naturally valuable. So from a career standpoint, of course, it'd be great experience to be able to work in regulatory affairs, to get that experience, and whether you want to grow within reg affairs or go a different direction, that knowledge is always going to be helpful. I really think that if you get a foundation in regulatory affairs, it's easier to pivot, especially laterally, if that's something you're interested in doing, moving from functional area to functional area. Again, if you kind of have that experience with working in regulatory affairs and being the liaison between a company and the FDA, and you can put that experience in your back pocket, that will always help you kind of make your next move. So overall, what does a career in regulatory affairs look like from the bottom up? It's generally, again, pretty similar to every other functional area. You're going to start out with the specialist or associate roles, so regulatory affairs specialist or regulatory affairs associate, or depending on how the company is structured, that could be a regulatory writer, and then you would go on to there, so senior associate or senior writer, and then manager, senior manager, director, etc. Pretty much the same hierarchy throughout a pharma company. So overall, I hope that gives you a pretty good overview of what regulatory affairs is. Again, I think it's really valuable to gain any regulatory experience wherever in your career you can get that, because again, that's very useful to leverage yourself and your own experience. The FDA and governmental agencies are kind of that center point of healthcare in general. So again, any experience and work you can do around that will really help bolster your resume. And speaking from personal experience, I really think regulatory affairs is actually really interesting, and you might really like it if you get into it, and you might want to stick through it. And again, even within regulatory affairs, there are so many different sub-departments and things to grasp and gain experience in. So whatever you're looking for your career, I really think regulatory affairs can fit into it. But that is our deep dive into regulatory affairs. I hope this video was helpful. As always, if you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me like a lot of you do all the time. If this video was helpful for you guys at all, feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe while you're at it. That tells the YouTube algorithm that this video is good and they should push it out to other people who might find it helpful. Lastly, if you guys like the hoodie that I'm wearing, I have this and many other designs on the FocusRx website. The link is in the description bar below, so feel free to check that out. That is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, you guys will see me in the next one.